Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our Helpful Folks webinar. Today's topic is life after BPS. Farming is a very important element of British life and also for us at Folk to Folk. It is vital that we all understand the impact of so many changes currently facing farmers and landowners, especially on the subject of farm support. Before I introduce our esteemed guest this afternoon, I'd just like to remind you how to ask questions. So on the right hand side of your screen, there should be a Q&A panel. If not, you can see a symbol of just on the top row, which looks like a speech bubble with a question mark inside it. If you click on that, it will open up the Q&A panel where you can type in your questions. Now, we are very delighted to welcome Jeremy Moody. Jeremy, a foremost authority on all the current developments. Thank you, Jeremy.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Ian. Thank you for your kind introduction and very good to come and present to you. Controlling the slides, we shall do in a moment. So the bulk of what I think I've been asked really to talk about is how we move to life after BPS, really. It's looking at the importance of business. It's looking at the schemes that government are bringing in as BPS is taken out, and then looking at some of the reactions that farmers, individual farmers making their own decisions, will have on the ground. Just a word as to why I might be doing this. I look after Secretary to the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers, as the professional association for many people acting for individual farmers on schemes. It's my job to try and be as closely in touch as I can be with developments, to think about them and to try to brief members acting for clients, acting for farmers, acting for landowners. Because we are looking at something we've really not done in this country for perhaps for 2.5 generations. The last time we really looked at rebuilding this country was when we came out of the Second World War, made major changes, including the Agriculture Act of 1947 and the Tenancies Act of 1948. And we're looking now post-Brexit, but with so much other change going on as well, at what can simply be called a generation's change in a decade. That's the 2020s. That's now. We started. We're in them. We left the European Union last year. We're now watching a pace of change and development of policy that is probably unprecedented across a whole range of areas, but very particularly agriculture, having been so bound into the EU. We have the past generation of area payments since McSharry going. We have the generation of climate change response coming, and much of that in this decade. We're moving from subsidy to public goods purchase, and that's an important shift and really the theme of today, looking to buy change in carbon, air quality, water quality, biodiversity. And at the same time, aside from Brexit, which is merely the occasion for a lot of this, we have the advent of rapid new major changes in technology, changes in markets, changing public tastes, a lot happening and a lot to look at this. And in many respects, good businesses are not waiting on government. They're having to look at what they can see because so much lies within their own business. Because if you look at the average, and we'll see in a moment how the averages vary, the average farm actually takes 80% of its gross income, of its turnover, from trade, from what it sells. Subsidy is the lesser part of that. Changes in performance, in price, in yield on produce matters far more relatively than movement in subsidy value. But inevitably, and today, we're looking at subsidy in this, but just to put it into some perspective. Clearly, upland extensive sheep farms may depend more upon subsidy. And as we'll see in a moment, some horticultural uses barely depend upon it at all. In that, though, and we'll talk more about this in a moment, new schemes are not BPS substitutes. BPS is money, straightforward contribution at the moment to income that goes. New schemes will be to buy change and to be looked at where they offer profit or serve other purposes, not just looked at as an income substitute. So here we see how subsidy breaks down as a contribution to different types of business. And you see that range that's coming through from grazing livestock at one end, hiding an enormous average between different types, right the way down to pigs, poultry, and glass houses and the like. But what we're looking at now is change coming through the market. We've had businesses protected by CAP support, now basic payment, and tariffs, the external boundaries against imports, for 50 years. And those have supported the industry, but they've buffered it against change as well. And people have perfectly naturally fed those into their cost base. They've protected business structures that might otherwise have changed. And to some extent, they can be presented as actually having slowed, but managed the process of decline, rather than encouraging people to look directly at markets. And so what happens now with the transition period in England, our 7-year transition period, is that we now see those factors change as businesses adjust, as businesses put pressure on costs, now think of new ways of working and new lines of business, and indeed the larger questions of all about who will be farming, what land and how. The really big questions as we move to a world outside where we've been for 50 years. And that's the point of the word transition in transition period. It's managing that process of dynamic change as businesses change, values adapt, more decisions become possible. We understand the markets we're in. And of course, for this, we've been on notice for 4 years already since the referendum of February 2018. We had the whole health and harmony consultation. We're not facing a cliff edge. Indeed, our trade deals have 15-year transition periods in them. All this is allowing businesses to adapt, adjust and find their way through managing change within the life cycles of the families that dominate the businesses that we have, and build new or changed businesses or find their way out. But the really big moral in that is it's not time to waste. As the Chinese are said to say, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago and the second best time is now. The time now is to come to events like this, to think through, to hear different people tell the same story, but in different ways, in ways that chime, help your thinking go forward, but to manage change before it manages you. And there is in this the parallel of manufacturing in the 1980s. Farming's cost structure is very much like manufacturing rather than the service sector, but very small businesses relatively, living with exchange rates internationally exposed. That is quite a potent combination. And manufacturing had to change away from a cosseted environment in the 1980s, radically restructure itself to be competitive. And at this point, farming is getting support through this change. So it's looking at that and using that support as we go through, because the moral from manufacturing is that we are still the world's 9th largest manufacturing nation. We skilled our workforce, we improved what we produce, we moved to high productivity goods, we used automation and technology, and we invested in research and development. All those are things that offer a parallel that shows that we can get through this, provided we manage it ourselves to our advantage. So it's reviewing and acting, and if you want to boil everything this afternoon down to a question, where do you, as an individual, as a family, want to be in 10 years' time? What are your resources, strengths, opportunities, liabilities, weaknesses, threats in trying to get there? And then how do you adapt to do that? And it's laying out a plan. It's taking stock, it's coming to decisions, and it's implementing those decisions, but there is no good argument for deferring improvement. So, with the preamble and the focus inherently and necessarily on you and on your businesses, and where you're acting for people, advising clients on their businesses, we are now running our own show. The point of Brexit was sovereignty, was making our policies and having our own scrutiny. So looking here, particularly at English agricultural policy, and Ian's kindly advised me that everybody here is likely to be predominantly interested in England. Wales is going to go down a similar route, and I'll happily answer questions about Scotland and Northern Ireland, should there be any. We're looking at the powers taken by the Agriculture Act 2020. That newly on the statute book, proposing to support food production as well as the environment. Twin goals, as we'll see in a moment, giving powers to manage policy. But critically in this is this notion of public money for public goods. And these are things which the market doesn't necessarily pay for, but where society or government wants to achieve improvement. So it's attenuating flooding, it's improving biodiversity, it's improving soils, environmental gain, animal welfare. And those are the goals that are coming through in the new schemes beginning to unfold. Somewhere there will be a slide that will move. Somewhere. Here we are. So DEFRA's twin aims, as I've said, are they want to see a vibrant, competitive, and I've emphasised that, sustainable agriculture. That's the business side of it, consistent with achieving net zero and the climate change goals. something that was coming through very much in a meeting this morning with DEFRA. But also, and the bit that there's been more focus on, is improving the environment and achieving those outcomes. And you see at the bottom of this slide that major switch in spending, even by 2024, that the share of the money that goes to basic payment is halved, and the share of the money going to the environment more than doubles. And that's a switch just by 2024, never mind where we go by 2028. We are rewriting legislation across the UK. We are outside the EU, and you would have seen some of the benefits of that in looking at the way countryside stewardship, for example, has been written, how greening has gone from basic payment, some of the other changes in basic payment, the shift in approach to inspections and penalties, and indeed alongside that changes around tenancy law and so on coming through. So to the engine. The engine here is that slow death of basic payment. It's a legacy scheme. It's seen as yesterday's scheme in DEFRA and in government. They've never seen that it bought anything. It never had a purpose. It really existed because there'd been monies before it. And so already the application forms that went in May are already asking in principle for 5% less money, albeit there are other flexibilities around that. But they're already, as you will see from the table below, taking more from the larger claimants. So that if you were among our largest claimants, you could have lost 2/3 of your money by 2024. But 2027, it's all gone. We've been given this chart of progression through to 24, the possible life of this Parliament. We're then being offered early exits from basic payment. We've got the consultation is now out. It closes on August the 11th. And if you were a basic payment claimant in 2015 and you're still there, or an inheritor of your business is still there, you can be paid up to 100,000 of rolled up remaining basic payment money, no new money, in order to retire. In order that you then expected to sell, give, lease, surrender almost all your land, if you're leasing it out for at least 5 years, but you then have command as a lump sum of all your basic payment that you would otherwise spend the next few years getting. And we wait to see, of course, the important question of the tax treatment around that. Quite a lot of detail already. We expect government answers on this to come in October and applications for this to be in the first half of 2022. Beyond that, we have delinking. To date, to claim single and now basic payment, you've had to occupy qualifying farmland in qualifying ways for qualifying uses and manage it as a farmer. That all goes from 2024. That brings home the pace of change. Entitlements will last have a functional use in May 2023, less than 2 years' time. You feel the pace of change warming up. Things that have been talked about in presentations like this for the last 4 or 5 years are now actuality, reality, and happening. So the first component in what's happening with this is the regulatory baseline. And quite a lot of presentations miss out on this. But this is where they will pay you to do things above what the law requires. That regulatory baseline, as cross compliance goes, because basic payment will be delinked from land, this is where the law will require farmers to do things. And there will be minimum standards, as we know, around, for example, water pollution and the expected increase in slurry storage capacity. Change inspection regime and so on comes with this. A lot of shift of stance, things that both we and DEFRA are having to get used to. But just watch that regulatory baseline, because the new world I'll move into only operates above that. Below that, you breach the regulations, you are a sinner, you will be penalised, you will be fined for polluting water or whatever it might be. So countryside stewardship is now looked at more cheerfully by DEFRA than it was. They've simplified it, they've focused it more. You're allowed now either to extend an agreement as it expires, but that's old EU rules with old rules on penalties now going back quite a number of years, or you can mirror it, enter a scheme, the same scheme, but under new English rules. We are in the closing days of applications for the 22 payments, which are under those new English rules. A much wider range of capital grants coming through, and that's put a lot of pressure on the new system this spring. We're hoping we could get more flexibility in application dates, but that's talk yet to come. And countryside stewardship again available for starting in 23 and 24. And indeed, you can also, in most cases, extend your HLS scheme if that suits you, but you do remain under EU rules. So penalties on that could now run back 14 years if that were appropriate. So that's, if you like, the bridge. But we're now looking at the bridge not from the past, but the bridge to the future. The bridge to 2024 and what many of you will have heard of as environmental land management and its schemes. It's now broken down really into 3 schemes coming through. We've had tests and trials and now pilots. The one that's starting, you'll see most of this year, is Sustainable Farming Incentive. And these, simply described, and they could feel quite like a traditional agri-environment scheme in some ways, but these are measures you can do while farming. The pilot is starting this year. You had the chance to express interest. We'll look at that in a moment. And all who expressed interest are applying. At a higher level, there's local nature recovery, measures alongside farming. This could be about substantial habitat change on a farm alongside farming, possibly still compatible with farming, possibly instead of farming. And then the highest level, landscape recovery, is for larger scale collaboration around those changes. As I said, well, the pilot slide should come up in a moment, but if you expressed interest, and 2,178 did in this spring, they've all got the next couple of months in which to apply and to enter a scheme which will run until 2024. October start, first payments under it coming monthly from November. Now, some people will have applied in order to preserve options. They may have taken other choices. Actually, my view is that if you can go into the pilot, you probably should, because it opens the door to future changes, future movements in payment rates, in a way that future schemes in the SFI won't allow you to go back. And the pilot offers a wider range of options and is future proofed. It also comes with a £5,000 a year participation payment for you to help the time that people in it will spend engaging with government, answering surveys, maybe showing people around, helping design where this scheme goes. SFI 22, and details came out at Cereals just last month, is more limited. This will start early next year. It will have, though, things that can be done on countryside stewardship land, whereas SFI pilot is on land that's not in countryside stewardship. So this will particularly be focused on soils, but also includes something for moorland, and is the first step on what we'll look at in a moment, the animal health and welfare pathway, in which it will pay for a vet's visit a year to come and do diagnostic testing for endemic diseases and to try and help understand, but also manage health and welfare issues. So selling public goods, so just a pause before we look at some other schemes coming along. Those are all seen to be public goods, benefiting carbon in soil or whatever it might be. It's very easy for the government to talk about buying public goods. Why should you sell them? This is a transaction like any other. Government is looking at it as a transaction, and indeed the Cereal statement included setting out payment principles as to how it moves from just compensating you for lost income and costs. This is moving to make it attractive to you, but value for money for government. And there's the tension in that, as in all markets. But what are the terms? What does it require you to do? Where's the margin in it for you? How does it fit with your business? All of those are questions perfectly legitimate for a seller. And so those are the things that we will be exploring. And then, of course, how it might fit with private finance, whether, as with the Arla dairy farm schemes, is where the purchaser of the milk is interested in the management of the farm, or indeed it's completely separate private sector interests in biodiversity gain for development or other things coming down the tracks. So again, in this bridge to the future, we have a number of other schemes. And what I'm just trying to do is list them for you so you can begin to see the matrix, almost a kaleidoscope of what there is. As of just last month, they've opened up the Protected Landscape Scheme. And this is designed to help people in or very close to national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty. It's a bridge to 24 for people engaged in environmental improvement or public access or perhaps something educational. I've mentioned the animal health and welfare pathway, and this straddles productivity and welfare. Healthier animals are more productive animals, but welfare is something the public likes to say it wants, but is rather bad at paying for. Here is a chance that they've started with those vets visits, and this will develop and with a lot of other legislation around animal welfare as support here for farming. Woodland Creation Officer, UCO, again opened last month, and we expect this autumn pilot on tree health, again removing diseased trees and restocking. But we have that other goal of productivity. And the Farming Investment Fund, I'm expecting to open later this autumn and then progressively develop. The Equipment Technology Fund will probably look quite like Countryside Stewardship Small Grants Productivity Fund, but with a new list. I'm pressing for a lower threshold. It may come in waves. We shall see how it goes, but this will be sitting there for specified items to be purchased. The higher level of that is for things that will transform farming, and that a lot of that could be around technology and infrastructure. But that's capital support for changing farm businesses. The resilience support is about background advice, comfort, helping people talk through the kinds of things we're talking through now, but how it might bear on their businesses. And the contracts for the interim phase of that have just been awarded, and then there'll be a full phase next year. More support for innovation, a slurry investment fund from later next year, again linking back into what is now, I think, a very dominant theme in government around water quality. And then we'll hear more in the autumn about policy support for new entrants, policy support really rather than money. Alongside that, we have the Environment Bill nearing the completion of its stages in Parliament. Mention it very, very briefly, because it'll touch on some of the areas I've just talked about. We'll have a planning system for habitats, fitting in with development control. And that mention of biodiversity gain I made just now, here there may be deals between landowners and farmers and developers to enable development to go ahead by improving biodiversity on land. And a lot to do on that, some of that through conservation covenants that again we might pick up in questions. So that's the landscape as it evolves. Basic payment goes by 27, halved and more by 24. New schemes phased in, environmental land management nationally available by 2024, and steadily replacing countryside stewardship and HLS over the years through to 28. Schemes that buy change from you as the regulatory baseline rises, you incurring costs, you driving your own changes to respond to the loss of basic payment and what it does to businesses. So what do you do on the farm? And this is merely a slide looking at some of the options that you can play with. Your enterprise choices. Where do you go on innovation? A key question for many is, do you stay a commodity farmer, merely focusing then on your competence and on the timeliness and on how far you can lower the unit cost of production? Or do you tailor the business to produce something that's not a commodity? Is there a viable trade for you in selling those public goods? Does it sit alongside? We'll look at that in a moment. Is this the point where actually a new generation should take on the management, 1 or 2 generations down the family? What's discussed between landlord and tenant in all of this? Do you take the BPS as a lump sum? Do you let your land out? Do you go into joint ventures? And non-agricultural diversification. All those are different reactions for different people as we come through on this. And with a bit of luck, the slide moves in a moment. So adding value. We have good people who can produce commodities, and you don't have to be the cheapest in the world. You have to be able to sell at the price the world clears at. And for cereals, we've been in that position for quite some time. But what will earn a margin above this? Added value operations, or growing something special or different that the market will pay for, where you're not competing with the man from Kansas and the man from the Ukraine. How do you scale up speciality if you can do it so it's enough to earn an income and actually stands its costs? Are you looking to add value to your capital, manage your tax position or other ways, or to your income? How do you do this with data? What are you looking at in soils? Other activities on and from the farm? Indeed, is farming the only form of land management? We're looking at this being a diverse set of outcomes as we come to this. And the heart of that is the environment as an enterprise. Just like wheat, just like lamb, just like milk, it's there competing with your choices. And alongside productive farming with trees, improving soils is good for carbon and water management, but profoundly good for farming. Once you have got an improved answer out of this, there's synergies there to think about. But if you're on a very marginal, low yielding arable land, some of these environmental options may be your best way to earn money, whether as alternating with wheat or indeed thinking of other ways in which it fits together as a business. So you're looking at those things. And when you look at more serious permanent land use changes for habitats or woodland, does that shut off to more opportunities than you can afford to have shut off? And I think there are questions again around all of that to think. And just in passing, because it may come up as a question, on carbon, I'm not clear the values yet there in carbon at farm scale. And I see the price of carbon rising substantially as we go through the coming decades. So even if it were right, it may be a later time is the time to be dealing. But other things like biodiversity will attract private finance. We will have companies wanting to solve their own problems. and seeing some farms and landowners as ways to do that. And talking about carbon, Microsoft agreed to deal with a large Australian farm to offset 40,000 tonnes of carbon just last year. Processors and purchasers, I mentioned Arla and others, want to protect their supply chains and their reputations as we go through these ages, while insurers, developers, water companies have all got risks and problems to manage that, as we've seen with water companies, can be resolved by deals. So much of this, and I think so much of the 2020s, comes back to looking at rural land management, how we adapt, where we best earn our shillings and protect our futures. And that's just the competing land uses. And you can read the Dimbleby report out last week, a critical part of its discussion of land management as part of the National Food Strategy, as arguing where do you strike the right balances in land use. A key argument in it is that 20% of our land produces 3% of our calories. Is that then better managed for transactions to do other things like carbon sequestration, like biodiversity, like greenhouse gas reduction? And of course, some of that goes into renewable energy and solar farms and the like, but you might also look at bioenergy crops, plants for plastic, just as much as we look at urban development, and of course, the production of food as part of this. The pressures on land management choices simply become more intense as this decade passes. So there's a very large issues and very personal answers. Each landowner and farmer will be finding their own way through this, and even apparently nearly identical farms, so if there are any, nearly next door to each other, may, because of differences in personality, difference in financial resource, difference in land tenure, difference in available skills, find different answers. And there are no absolute answers, and we're moving to a less standardized rural economy. You could hunker down and take the pain, and some will, and that may be completely rational. Others will seek to seize the opportunity well, so they've built the people who will be the farming empires of the future. All those choices are there. One of the things I want to do, and why I'm keen to do presentations like this, is to help people understand this as well as they can, and for as many people as possible to find the positive answers for them, rather than wake up in 25 or 26 and wonder where the basic payment application form has gone, why the December payment isn't half what they thought it was, and find that they've been managed by change, hung out to dry by change, rather than responding, managing, looking ahead, doing the best they can for the future. So this is about helping people take the better answers, about negotiating obstacles, and indeed, in summary, about managing change well before it manages us. And government is stepping in within that framework to provide a level of support, a bridge to the future. It's withdrawing simple income support, but so much of that income support has been in the last 30 years, indeed before with intervention aid, gone into costs. Now is the chance where we manage and restructure our businesses, look at what we do, hope that the next slide comes up, which it finally has done, and we take our own choices, our own responsibilities for where we are. We're moving on from the post-war world. One of the things that I'm doing is looking at what were we farming before the CAP? What did we do when we were given the chance to go for 100% set aside back in the late 80s? Where do we go for what we need to know beyond the farm gate about markets, about tastes, about speciality, where people will pay more, as we've seen during the pandemic? They will pay for locally produced food. Local sourcing of groceries, local sourcing of meat has done well during this. So how do we best manage that and capitalise it? And I come back to that question. Where do you want to be in 10 years' time? How do you realistically want to get there? Use the transition period to do it. And how do we use this to give the opportunities to the best who will make the best of this? And in this, completely independently of almost anything I've talked about, is that technological revolution and innovation going on out there, substantial radical change in the tools that we have to use, from genetic editing through to data, through to developments in alternative foods, and that's a whole range of things coming through, but also detail and data about how we know the farm and manage it. And those who use those best will be among the people who take advantage of the future. And if we don't, our competitors abroad will. So the moral is here, thinking now, this presentation, talking among yourselves, deciding critically, and then of absolute necessity acting, actually implementing change, and that does take a little while. Hence the time to start now, if not 2, 3, 4 years ago. But I hope that's been useful. I hope it's highlighted the importance in this of business, that we're not solely dependent upon support. We need to look beyond that, but the change is being driven by changes in support, and the aid being given by new schemes are reasons for acting now before the future happens to us. So hoping that's been useful, and thinking the next slide should promise questions as and when it comes up. Ian, I'll very happily take any questions.
Thank you, Jeremy. I think you've done very well with your slides. I think, as you said earlier on, the heat must have elongated the wires, so it just took a bit longer to come through. Yeah, I've got a few questions through actually, Jeremy, and we've got time for them. You've answered one already. Has HMRC actually determined how the lump sum will be taxed from the retirement scheme? But let's
just comment on. I was going to say, let's just comment on that a little. The DEFRA. I mean, I've been trying to get DEFRA to answer this for about 3 years. We know DEFRA are talking to HMRC. The options are: is it taxable to income or is it taxable to capital gains tax? And the question around that depends on how the scheme, when it comes, is structured. But there's a range of tax outcomes according to anybody's individual position, from us managing to make it work as part of what was entrepreneurs relief and potentially a 10% tax rate, or for some people it kicking them as one single lump sum into a 45% additional income tax rate.
Yeah.
Capped at 100,000, that has radically different outcomes as to whether the scheme is of marginal interest or of no interest at all.
Yeah. No, I had heard that. Am I right in saying, Jeremy, though, that this is only going to be available for a relatively short period of time?
Yeah, it's only available for application in early 2022. DEFRA is doing this for 2 reasons. One is that this is bringing structural change forward, if people notice it and take advantage of it. I might hazard a view that it might not be attractive enough to persuade somebody who is thinking of continuing to change. But if you're already thinking of giving up, it prompts a conversation in the family, it prompts a landlord-tenant discussion, it lubricates the pace of, it lubricates change, and that's not a bad thing. But the 100,000 is a deposit for a house. It's not buying a house. It tops up a pension. It's not a pension, but it helps the discussion. Worse things have happened to people, but it is only the future basic payment that you would otherwise have got if you trust future governments to pay it. So the longer you left it, if they were to offer it in later years, there'd just be less basic payment to come in. So they're doing it at the earliest point. They've got the maximum to go with.
Yeah.
The other reason they're doing it is exactly that. It follows from that point, which is that by the time you get to 2024, if the average basic payment is 16,000, quite a lot of basic payments will be trivial by then, and yet carry the whole superstructure of basic payment, inspections and penalties and Lord knows what. So 2 arguments, but yes, this is a one-off opportunity. So look at it now. When government tells you what the rules are, judge whether they're possible for you or not. We may have a number of issues, particularly for farming partnerships, to look at about how the next generation's handled within that. So small warning on that one. It's there to be considered.
Thank you. A question relating back to the SFI, the 8 standards that you quoted. Will those standards make it sort of relatively easier for most farming scenarios to get into that scheme?
I think it looks that way for most broadacre farms. The pilot's intended to test across a wide range of farms, and they're particularly anxious to get some pig men in, some poultry men in, and so on. But I think it's almost, in practical terms, it's almost inevitable that farms with higher value output per acre, like dairying, and like quite a lot of pig and poultry operations, may well find it less attractive overall, albeit they may be less involved with existing agri-environment schemes. because SFI as a pilot is at this point only available on land that's not in countryside stewardship. So I think, but for broadacre combinable cropping and most grazing livestock farms, it will be the upland farms may feel they've got an issue over the moorland standard, which is coming with the SFI 22 and should be available, I think, to pilot people. And none of this works at this stage on commons for the pilot for particular reasons. But taking the generality of broadacre farming, I think so. And I suppose I'd simply quote a smaller Norfolk farmer, arable man, who went through this right at the beginning, and he reckoned that what he could do on his farm would about give him a margin of about 2/3 of his basic payment. So he's feeling happier, and he said, and it will and half improve the shooting. And that made it for him.
Going back to your opening comments, I mean, we did agree that we would just cover England. Well, I said England and Cornwall in your presentation, and we've had actually 2 or 3 questions in about Scotland. Is there a comparable organisation to you, Jeremy, in Scotland that people, that any listeners could direct questions to?
Well, the simple answer is yes, it's us. We're UK wide.
Oh, right. Okay.
I mean, we have a Scottish association, but for practical purposes, it's as easy to view it as us. Scottish policy is a bit hidden in plain sight, and it's a bit of a curious story. The public stance of the Scottish government has to date been that they really rather begrudge all this. They'd love to rejoin the CAP. They want to keep the less favoured area support scheme going. And really don't want to see any change to 24, and they'd rather not see much change after. However, and I think this is a critical point, that just as England's schemes you can see being very much framed by the 25-year environment plan, Scotland's thinking on rural and agricultural land management policy is heavily framed within its climate change objectives, which are as serious in Scotland as they are in England. So actually, back around the end of last year, and particularly earlier this year, before the Scottish parliamentary elections, the Scottish government published its climate change plan update 2018 to 2032. And that gives you, in quite a lot of detail, followed up in the SNP manifesto, what they're actually thinking about doing for agriculture. We could well see beef payments become conditional. Well, they were talking about this year, but by now it probably means next year. We're looking at half of farming payments being conditional by 2025. We're looking at heavy support for land management by forestry and peat. Some opportunities for people who wish to retire to take those income by changing the use of their land rather than a retirement payment. We've had the farmer-led review groups, most obviously the Suckler Cow Climate Scheme group by Jim Walker. And I think, just to summarise before moving on to other people's questions, but if this is beginning to answer the Scottish question, or that Scottish question, it says that there's a lot of efficiency can be done with suckler beef production that could achieve greenhouse gas emissions of up to 35% before numbers need to be cut. And I think that's quite a stark moral, because quite a lot of those efficiencies are things people could already be doing. The climate change policies of the Scottish government are there in plain sight. It's just very few people have used the word agriculture in connection with them, but go look at them.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. I've got 2 or 3 questions on entitlements. Now, well, you'll tell me. One question focuses on if a farmer takes the retirement option, the retirement scheme, and relinquishes his entitlements, what about the new entrant coming onto that farm? Will they be void of entitlements then, or will there be a reserve? How's that going to work?
If you take the retirement scheme, the claimant's entitlements are all cancelled. And just simply in passing, given the tax interest, that will, for those where entitlements have been inherited or purchased, that will give rise to a negligible value claim at that point for capital gains tax, should somebody need that. In terms of the land then, that land, like all other land at this point, is naked of entitlements. So somebody with entitlements could bring them and apply them on that land. You could go and buy them, though of course by this point you're only really getting the value from 23 from them. I think there will not be a reserve. I think that's the point when DEFRA closes the reserve, but DEFRA will say this is advancing the new world, and this is where people are looking at how they farm without those subsidies, but they will have all access to all other schemes. So if that begins to answer your question.
Yeah. Thank you. I've got a farmer who thinks he's going to be able to apply for several elements of the package going forward. Is there a cap, Jeremy, on what funding any particular holding can apply for?
There has been no discussion whatsoever of any cap in government. And the logic for that would be if they want to buy public goods, somebody who has more land can provide more public goods. Why should you, and particularly when you come to look at issues like flooding and climate change, the issues are so large that it would be a bit quixotic to start imposing caps and other restrictions on people. So no talk of a cap on this. You can buy, just as you can buy 1,000 sheep in the market or one. So here you can enter these schemes without apparent limit, so far as you choose to.
An interesting question from a small grassland farm up in Yorkshire, sort of asking, is there a recommendation that the small grassland farms, upland farms, would be better off in a high level stewardship?
I think that is so case by case specific, according to what you do, according to how you sell, the land type and current management is only a part of the mix. And I think at the level of a presentation over the internet, I would hesitate to give any recommendation.
Sure.
HLS, as I said, the downside to HLS is if you're in it already, is you've got an agreement. You understand. You may well like it. The downside is if something's found wrong with it, the penalties can now go an awfully long way back. You might then wish to look at whether you can enter other schemes. The difficult part of trying to provide any further advice is the bit of the package that's coming that is least shaped is that second level scheme, local nature recovery. And that would be, if you like, your higher level on-farm scheme. It could be driving substantial habitat change and woodland and the like. You might or might not like that. It could be seen as nearer HLS. Some people might like that. But its shape is not yet clear.
Jeremy, thank you. We've worked you very hard for the last nearly 45 minutes, and that was absolutely fantastic. A very comprehensive presentation. Thank you so much. Just one other question I'd like to pull into my conclusion. I mean, at Folk to Folk, we do an enormous amount of funding for diversification on farms across England, Scotland, and Wales. And there's rather an emotive question actually. I want to farm. I don't want to have a B&B or a wedding venue. I want to farm. Is there a future for me?
If you're good, yes. If you come unencumbered by old ideas, if you're technically competent, if you think you can sell well, those are the people who will find the opportunities in the new world. It's understanding your markets. As quite a lot of this will turn on using the new technologies. And I think an important theme in this, because quite a lot of people who pose that sort of question are bred in the bone wanting to rear livestock. Look at the markets therefore in vegetables, in horticulture, the people who are building quite niche specialist, but quite successful businesses in that. And the emphasis that will come, and it's sitting there in the Dimbleby report and so on, around local sourcing of food. And the people who can, again, rise to that, particularly in areas where there's perhaps less arable than might once have been the case. Again, opportunities there. But it's as in the rest of the market across the whole economy, seize your skills, your opportunity, take full advantage of your luck, be good and sell well.
Jeremy, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, on your behalf, I just thank Jeremy for an absolutely wonderful presentation. We're so lucky to have his time today. From everybody at Folk to Folk, we're here to help. We're here to help you with finance for your farm, for your small rural businesses. Please come and talk to us if you think we can help. But from me for now, thank you very much and a very good afternoon to you all. Thank you.